you want to leave it there on a nice peaceful C major? Do you want me to do one more and lead you into the beginning? All right. So this is one of my favorites for calling in the energy to be here and celebrate. It's probably one of the most famous pieces that J.S. Bach ever wrote. And I love the way that it grows and grows and grows and leads to this tremendous welcome, everyone. So this will be introduction for you.
Good morning. My name is Mark Langton, and I want to thank everyone for coming here today to celebrate the life of my father. When my mother died 6.5 years ago, after a certain interval, it became necessary to have the difficult conversation with my father about the dispensation of her remains. So I took the opportunity to ask him. I said, "Dad, you know, you've never told me what your wishes are. You know, you don't have an advance directive. It's really never come up. So I'll just ask you directly, do you want to be cremated?" And he paused for a moment and thought about it. And finally he replied, "Surprise me." He said, "I know." He said, "I got an idea. Burial at sea." And I said, "Okay, Dad, that could get complicated. I mean, you got to rent a boat. You got to get you on the boat. You got to get you off the boat. It could get expensive." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I'll tell you what. I'll take a cruise, and then halfway there, I'll jump. Cheaper for everybody. A few days later, he came to me looking very solemn and very serious, and said, "You know, I've thought about it, Marco, and I'd like to be placed in an urn with your mother." I said, "Okay, Dad, whatever you want." He said, "Yeah, but I don't want to be cremated." Probably one of the best parts of having Dan Langton as a father was the funny part. He was quite simply, consistently hilarious. It was a unique sense of humor. It was unconventional, nuanced, often profane, and often his jokes didn't land until after the fact. I mean, don't get me wrong. There were the, eye-rolling dad jokes, and there were stories that he repeated over and over again. But he really was at his funniest when he was totally spontaneous. Even when I was a little kid, he played these weird jokes on me. I was like 7 years old. I'd be in the bathtub and shampooing my hair, and I'd submerge myself in the water to rinse, and all of a sudden I'd feel this third hand creeping down my scalp, like Abbott and Costello meet the ghosts or something. He thought it was funny, and I thought it was funny because I knew why he thought it was funny. Once when the three of us were out to dinner at the Irish Cultural Center, he said, "You know, Mark, I can find Frank Sinatra in the library now." And I said, "Dad, you can find Frank Sinatra on my phone." He said, "Oh, yeah? How are you going to find him with that phone shoved halfway up your wrist?" Back when I was struggling with a drug and alcohol problem a lifetime ago, I called my parents from a rehab, and my mother sounded downright giddy on the phone with relief because I was doing pretty well at that point. And so she put my dad on, and I said, "Dad, does Mom look as happy as she sounds?" He said, "I don't know, let me look." Turned away for a moment, he came back on the phone. "She looks unclean," he said. Once he said, "Do you know what my first words were? My first word was?" I said, "No, Dad." What?" He said, "Quote." I said, he said, "Now, can you guess what my last words will be?" His actual last words were on the day before he died. He raised one finger and said, "I've made a decision. I am going to," and then he fell asleep and then died a day later. Now, I don't know that he planned it as an elaborate joke, but it's the kind of joke he would have planned. It's the kind of joke he would have loved. He tended to have a unique, weirdly accurate take on world events. Right after 9/11, I asked him what he thought about us invading Iraq, and he said, "Son, here's what I learned as a young man in after Pearl Harbor. When you're caught with your pants down, very important to keep your shirt on." We went to New York, the three of us, for Thanksgiving a year after 9/11. Both my parents grew up there, so they wanted to see the changes for themselves. And you know how they say the mood in New York completely changed and everybody was helping each other and everybody was nice to each other, which is completely alien to a guy like my dad who grew up rough in Irish Harlem. So the first time someone said, "Excuse me," on the subway, he said, "What, are they hanging people now?" After a day of sightseeing during that trip, my mom was taking us to every museum and landmark in Manhattan, and my dad was looking kind of ragged, green around the gills, and so he was really struggling. So my mother said, "Okay, Danny, you can go back to the hotel." And he said, "Thank you," he said, and we watched him inch to the subway. So we stood above the stairs of the subway and watched him inch down the stairs. And at one point, he looked back at us and said in a very weak voice, "If I never see the two of you again, fuck you," and went dancing down the stairs. Jazz hands. Those of us who knew and loved him, who knew his private side, knew that he used that humor to deflect. There is a darker, brooding side to my father's intellect that was almost impenetrable. He had this textbook Asperger's spectrum-y inability to pick up on social cues and all the savant gifts that tend to come with that. He was a words guy and a numbers guy. Very rare to have both. He had this uncanny eidetic memory. I mean, he could quote statistics from 1933, who's who in baseball. He could take pictures of a page just by blinking his eyes and then close his eyes and read you the page. It was like a carnival trick. And his gigantic head, and by the way, it was really gigantic. It was this enormous cranium, and it was filled with rhyme schemes and mathematical equations and number puzzles that he invented that no one else could follow. He once invented a unit of measurement that he called the millihelen, which he defined as that amount of beauty which launches one ship, the millihelen. So as a result, like many men of that World War II generation, especially Irishmen, he was often emotionally unavailable. It was a survival strategy for him. I understood it. "I've got Irish Alzheimer's," he used to say. "That's where you forget everything but your resentments." So for the most part, growing up, our father and son relationship was often more like a vaudeville team, where each of us knew when to come in. It served us. It kept things safe. It kept things, if not superficial, it kept things light. I think the world was, the volume of the world was up too loud for my dad sometimes. In a rare moment of self-disclosure, he said to me recently, "Make no mistake about it, Marco, I'm a candle in a hurricane." But where he was not emotionally unavailable to me was his poetry. That was where I could find my father. That was where I could access the depths of his infinite heart. I practically have most of his early work memorized. I felt I had to. I could quote a lot of it better than he could. His poetry was everything to him. That and teaching younger poets how to do it. Nothing made him prouder than the huge bookcase in our house of all the published poetry collections by former students. They took up an entire wall. And unlike many of his contemporaries, he was absolutely obsessed with craft, with classical poetic forms, when he wasn't breaking the rules. He wrote in many voices. He could channel the visions of a 17-year-old French girl on her deathbed in the 14th century, a 12-year-old boy on a wagon train in the late 1800s, a Shanachie from a small Irish village, an oral historian from a small Midwestern town. And he was incredibly prolific. Right up until a few weeks before he died, he was pounding out a steady stream of poems on his manual typewriter, 8 or 9 finished poems a week. "I'm an old man in a hurry," he used to say. And not just limericks, mind you. Sonnets, pantoums, villanelles, sestinas. Not to mention the correspondence. I'm only now discovering the sheer volume of it. He had a rich, ongoing correspondence with former students. For years, he had a long and lively correspondence with William Carlos Williams, his mentor. A vivid correspondence with Norman Mailer in the 60s. Letters from Lillian Carter, of all people, Jimmy Carter's mother, who was apparently a fan. He could break your heart in just a couple of lines, especially the unbelievably romantic poetry he wrote to my mother. Their relationship spanned 72 years. He met her when she was 17 and he was 20, and they married a year later. I once said to him, you know, Dad, I really don't know much about your life before you met Mom, before you married Mom. And he said, that's because I didn't have a life before I married your mom. And he meant it. As I've been sorting through his huge book collection, I still find love notes he would hide in books he knew she was reading or would read eventually. Small strips of paper hidden in the pages. He wrote these short love poems to her that could stop you where you stand. One of them, just 3 lines. Either you get it or you don't. He wrote, I thought I couldn't love you any more than I did, but I forgot about braids. That one was called Good Morning. I forgot about braids. Or single lines that could stop your heart. I saw you first when childhood still could play quick games across your face. Or, it seems so right that you'd ignore your youth, a small bouquet some helpless lover sent. Or, you are a rain so fine I didn't notice you starting. If life were a week, you'd be Sunday. There are also all these aphorisms that I still constantly hear in my head that former students quote back to me all the time. Some of them from poems, others were just things he would say that you could live your life by. Know every rule you break. Easy glum, easy glow. The grass is always greener on the other guy's color TV. All stories are true. Never salute or kneel. Life teaches. Art reminds. There was one sonnet he wrote to my mother called With Her in an Urban Forest. It's a true story, apparently. They were walking in the Panhandle, the park across the street from our home, and my dad describes a cacophony of blackbirds and parrots in the trees above them, a deafening din, and then all of a sudden it stopped. Just silence. And in the couplet at the end of that sonnet, my father writes, Eve, I said, before the moment flew, they all stopped to look at you. I'll close with this. 7 years ago, my father wrote a letter to the English department faculty on the day that he retired at 90. I'll let his words speak for him. I have often felt I was living near history rather than in it. My father was in the Irish Republican Army and had to run for his life. My wife is a German Jew and had to run for her life. I was in the squadron, but not the planes that dropped Fat Man and Little Boy. Our niece was murdered on 9/11. I have lived in 4 neighborhoods in my life, mostly by happenstance. I grew up in Harlem, moved to the Village, from there to Rive Gauche, wound up in the Haight-Ashbury. I am not the reason all 4 are world famous. As I said, I was middle-aged before I stood in front of a class. I also said I had held a variety of jobs. I didn't say I was good at them or happy with them. But with teaching, I came alive. There's just no other way to say it. The kindness, the sweetness, I dare to say love, were there from the beginning. The writers I knew and know, but especially the ones for whom we can now put together a complete works. And the students who listened to me and went into teaching themselves with always my last words to them. After all, I'd say, there are few ways to live an honorable life. I am as lucky in my life as a man can possibly be. At this point, I'd like to bring up my father's publisher, Diane Frank.
Mark, that was beautiful. And seeing all those photos, this is better? Yeah? Lower? Is this good? Yeah, okay, thank you. So, Mark, that was just beautiful. And these photographs, seeing parts of Dan's life that those of us who were close to him as students and friends didn't have the opportunity to see, I was just in a state of joy. And then, of course, some tears hearing your stories. And here we are, a gathering of the Dan Langton fan club and the Eve Langton fan club. Dan Langton was my graduate advisor at SF State, my thesis reader, along with Kathleen Frazier, and my friend for life. As a faculty advisor, he was a lot more to us than just an educator. For most people, late 20s, early 30s is not a time of smooth sailing. We could talk to Dan about anything. When preparing for our comprehensive exams, Dan was the one who taught the course to teach us how to take the exam. He taught us a trick to use if we got into trouble. And sure enough, during my exams, he was the one who asked the question I couldn't answer. I mean, it was a really good question. I thought about it a lot for the next few years and eventually figured it out. But that morning, I just couldn't figure out what he wanted. So I used the trick he taught me on him. And I've also used it a few times on radio interviews. Blue Light Press published 2 of his books, During Our Walks and Personal Effects. And Mark, if you send us his best of later poems, we'll publish that too. And I don't want you to feel that you have to do this by yourself. Eric and I helped Dan with his 2 books that we published. We're happy to help with this book too. Anything you need. So when Dan sent the manuscript of During Our Walks, he was almost apologetic. He said that his previous publisher had gone out of business, and he had this book, and he only wanted me to publish it if I liked it, if it spoke to me. And it's like, are you kidding? The opportunity to publish my beloved mentor? I'm not going to do that, but I love the book. And I'm actually going to read you something from it. And then shortly after, there I was giving advice to my mentor about line breaks and, you know, a few little edits. That was kind of an interesting experience. So when I teach poetry workshops, I often find Dan's words coming out of my mouth, some of the things you already mentioned. His idea about obscure vocabulary in a poem is never send a reader to the dictionary. They might not come back. And one time I called him to ask for advice about a student who was writing poems I just couldn't find a way to like, which is kind of unusual for me. I can usually find something and then guide the poet to making more of the poem like that. And he said, never aim a machine gun at a cockroach. During the reign of the language poets at San Francisco State University, Dan was a voice for the kind of writing I love. And when I started Noe Valley Poetry, Dan and Kathleen Frazier were my first two features. So I'm going to share two poems, one that Dan wrote and one that he asked me to write, so one that I wrote for him. During our walks, just after the publication of this book, I invited Dan to Writers on Writing. I was teaching Writers on Writing in the OLLI program at San Francisco State. And a little bit about the book. He starts, this book is a series of monologues by the village explainer to a recent arrival. So I'm going to read the first talk during our walks, and what Dan asked us to do, the class, and I was very taken with this idea. You've got the village explainer, you have a new arrival in town, and he said, okay, who is this person who just came to town? Where did he come from? So this is the first page of During Our Walks. Mind if I walk with you? I've always had a companion on my walks, but they fall away. My pace ain't much. I see you didn't have any trouble catching up with me. We can stop here for a while if you want, get to know each other rather better than in those crowds at Tolliver's Fish and Brew. Ordinarily, you can see the lake, but not with this fog. I've been thinking about Sunday school, and you know, that big battle with Satan? I mean, a real war it was, they say. And then you telling Marie last night that there can't be a God with so much evil in the world? And then I said to myself, if there was a war, then there had to be a peace treaty. There's always a treaty. Now you can see the lake. Ain't it pretty? Of course, anywhere it rains, it's pretty. So I see a treaty with subclauses and stuff, but with one big article. God and Satan would pick a tiny, out-of-the-way planet like you said we are, and God would create the plants and Satan the animals. Problems would come up, sure. Like Satan would want cats, and God would answer, only if there are dogs. And bees, there'd be a hubbub about bees, since flowers need them. And the crazy things, like animal-eating plants and vegetarians. And down in the sea, where you can't see, dolphins for sure, but Satan made the octopus in his own image, if you ask me. And this was just like the devil. He made us to look like God. Sure explains a lot. Okay, this is what I wrote back when he asked me to write back to this character. Jumping a train. His name is Luke, and he lives in Ohio. Fields of wheat, gold, and flat in every direction, the way he'd like his mind to become. Opium poppies waving in a hot summer wind. Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. Actually, his name is Jacob. He ran off with his wife's sister and then decided he didn't like her any better. He escaped both of them by jumping a train to Pennsylvania, leaving a trail of debt in an unmarked mailbox. It was the height of the Great Depression, and the two sisters were forced to raise their children in the same house. They didn't speak to one another, but their children became best friends, riding a single sled down snowy hills in the winter, tossing stones at terracotta pipes until they broke open. My grandmother made peanut butter sandwiches for the hobos who knocked at the back door. Actually, his name is Raphael. His wife threw him out of the house after she read his diary. During my cello lessons, she always brought him a cup of tea. I wanted to tell her, leave him alone now, this is my time. But that was after she read his diary. He tells me his son has a lusting for musical instruments. Raphael jumped a train to the edge of the continent, and now he plays cello in Lithia Park for tourists who come to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. Small girls bring him yellow balloons. Actually, his name is Tim. His mother lights candles in a French church in New Orleans, and around her, the waters rise. That was before his lungs filled with water. When he was 19 years old, Tim jumped a train heading north and jumped off in a wheat field. Now he leaps into your imagination, inventing the life he was not allowed to continue. He sleeps in a cabin filled with candles, toy trains, and beautiful women who want to please him. The afterlife is a magic theater. He's on a beach covered with chocolate fondue, the waves shimmering turquoise in the distance. A mermaid is feeding him mangoes and papayas from a silver spoon. She whispers a secret before she jumps back into the water. He walks with the village explainer for 40 years until his beard is long and white, until he is the only one who remembers. So we have several readers coming up now, and then we're going to have an open mic. Hey, this is a group of poets and friends of poets. So for Poems and Memories, the first 6 readers, Maxine Chernoff, Paul Hoover, Lucille Langday, Melissa Hobbs, John Pappas, Will Walker. And then we'll have an open mic for a while. And then we'll enjoy some food together.
Hi, that must mean I'm Maxine Chernoff. I wanted to talk more than about poetry, actually. I guess I'm supposed to talk about poetry, but I wanted to talk about Dan and his relationship with me. I was his department chair for 19 years, which is a long time. It's a long time to be department chair. It's a long time to work with someone. And throughout all those years, I found Dan truly delightful, a real blessing to his students, and a blessing in an interesting way. Dan wasn't only kind and generous to our best students, he took an interest in everyone. And sometimes the students who seem kind of otherwise lost or forgotten clung to him in a way that really helped them out. And I really appreciated having someone like that around and seeing that in Dan's generous person. Another thing that always impressed me about Dan, and this was a yearly ritual, we would have a first meeting of the semester for our new graduate students, and he would always say to them, remember, we chose you because you were the best poets that we could find, and we're so glad you're here, and you belong here, and we welcome you, and we hope you're happy in our program. And that welcoming was a big deal. It was like an invitation to join a community that they then did to the degree that they chose. In a big program like ours, people people do different things. Some come to school and go home and you never hear from them, and some people make good friendships and hang around and are, part of the group. But Dan invited everyone in the same way to be a part of the group if they so chose. And I so much appreciated that about him. Mark, I was surprised when I heard Dan's letter to the English department, not because the letter was so lovely, but I knew that sometimes he wasn't all that happy being part of the English department. And one reason Dan said that he stayed so long teaching was because I kind of rescued him from that by offering him all of his courses in creative writing. And he said, this is such a blessing, because sometimes in the English department, Dan's exuberance and his wit and his kind of, freestyle of speaking and his non-academic kind of being, even though he was an academic, wasn't good for the stodgier ones, and they gave him trouble. So when he noticed the trouble and came to me, I said, let me talk to the dean and see if it's okay. And the dean said, as long as you have enough classes for Dan, sure, it's okay. So Dan made the switch to teaching and creative writing only about the last decade of his life. And he said that's what kept him teaching so long and made him happy. So I was interested in hearing the gracious note he wrote to them. But his relationship with them wasn't always as lovely as that note suggests. Dan was very funny, and it was always just, wonderful to meet him in the mail room or have him at a department meeting where he would have good ideas and also show that same kind of unexpected humor that everyone finds so charming about him and found so charming about him. And even his devotion to his wife was evident in the academic setting, because he would often speak of her in their walks and their life together. He was very affectionate about his feelings for her and very open about stating them and sharing them with us. So that was another really nice feature of his presence. I never had a single issue with Dan. And in 19 years of being chair, you do have issues with people now and then, but never with Dan. Dan was, he'd get his schedule, he was fine with that. Nothing was a problem, nothing was ever a problem. Also, I can't remember ever having students come to complain about Dan, which also is what a department chair listens to is, some teacher didn't treat me right, some teacher didn't give me the right grade. My teacher has a nose ring. What am I supposed to do about that? My teacher is gay, which was really a really weird one for San Francisco State. I said, well, I'm about the only teacher in the department who isn't gay, so I'm not sure who you expect to teach you. We're not going to change his gender preference in life, so I guess if you don't want a gay teacher, you need to drop the class. Dan was never one of those people who, in any way, annoyed or aggravated or upset students. He was always there to help them. And he always went out of his way to have office hours where he shared a lot and was very open and kind to people, and invited them in kind of like a good innkeeper or something. He says in a letter to me that I just found the other day, okay, right at the end, I want to read something before that. He said, you were the chief reason I stayed on well after 65. And well after 65 meant like 90, right? Didn't he teach till he was 90? Right, so that is well after 65. So the last almost 20 years of his life, so it's 70 to 90, I was his department chair. I knew you knew I would walk away when I saw any signs of irrelevancy. Former students still send me manuscripts and I happily hack away. So the other thing I was thinking should have been on the stage with us was his typewriter, because it is, oh my God. There it is. I made it appear. No, I didn't notice it. Was his typewriter, because he was one of the few poets who still typed. And that made his notes to students and everything in a way more intimate and fuller, because we tend in emails and little notes to people to be very brief. But he was expansive, and that was very, very remarkable for students who hadn't ever had a professor spend so much time paying attention to them. So that was another wonderful feature of Dan and his generosity. I was going to actually read from the poem that you quoted the end of, but now that this fell out of the book, I have to find it. So if you give me a minute, someone sing a song. Oh, here it is. Okay. With her in an urban forest. The dense insistence of crows, conversations on a train in China, the darkened trees looking ready to take fright, the din, as far as that goes, as real as our skin, as rain on the skittish legs of bees. Out for the first time at night. Then it was still, and all those branches burdened with the strain of silence bowed like Chinese on the crane in calm delight. Eve, before the moment flew, they all stopped to look at you. So that's such a beautiful poem, and obviously one of Mark's favorites. I bet it was really interesting to have Dan as a dad, and fun, Could be difficult, I imagine, too, but that's how it is with any parents. My kids tell me how awful I am, almost every day, and they're grown-ups. No, they like me too, though. But it's a tangled relationship, and in your speech, I very much heard the love and the beauty and the connection, and I know that losing his wife was so hard for him. And also a really unfortunate thing happened around that time is that I guess someone received news of her death, but the department never heard. So he thought none of us cared. And after I heard that she had died, which was sometime later, I wrote him a note, and he said, "Oh, thank God you wrote me, because I was feeling so bad that no one was there at the funeral. No one wrote me anything." That was really a tragedy that happened, and I'm glad that my note to him, sewed that back together for us. And that's actually what the previous part of this note to me is about. It's about how he thought he and she had been overlooked, but it was all an accident. So anyway, we're here to celebrate a wonderful man today, and we all have wonderful memories of him. I bet any one of us could stand up here and tell good Dan stories, because there are so many. So I will get off the stage and let other people do the same. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here celebrating Dan. He was a very good man, very direct in his manner as a poet. The subject of language poetry just came up later. We have all kinds of poetry being taught at the school, but language poetry was insurgent at one time. So Dan is on the earth with his feet planted on the ground, and he speaks directly. And that's an important feature for a poem to have, because he's really after the truth of the thing. And sometimes poetry becomes confusing to people because they think it's full of codes that they don't understand. I was teaching in English department in Columbia College in Chicago, and they asked me to teach the faculty how to read poetry, how to teach poetry. This was the faculty wanted to be taught how to teach poetry because they were mostly prose writers. So anyway, his groundedness is tremendously important. I want to read 4 poems. And letter to a poet who was never left to bet. We live in a house made of trees. My wife, my son, a dog, and I. We have a life as quiet as a bee's. I try to teach the 4 things I have learned, knowing that each will find a place to lie. I've put the 4 in other poems. Like you, I guess, I'm more a poet than a lover or a friend, though I am friendly, and my loves don't end. As to my country, it is much too strong to go the way it's going very long. Our books we do not read, our young are never singing, and they are never sung. I think we take more than we'll ever give. There is a tax on flowers where I live. What a surprising last line. You see, you're writing to someone in Tibet, and he just erupted capitalism on us. There is a tax on flowers where I live. He is hard-hitting, but they're soft blows. Soldiering. This is the dark Dan, I think. A gun on either side of me, a pond with blood and foam, shit and corpses in it. Among the lilies pads, empty boxes of bullets, bandages, and processed food. A quiet made up of too much blatant sound, grass and weeds smashed by up-to-the-minute shards of metal riven to find the fox's hole. I dug to do some transient good. It is morning in her bedroom. This is the second stanza. It is morning in her bedroom. Soon she'll dress and wander to her coffee, safe as sun, S-U-N. While I huddle beneath a canopy of shells, not seashells, not the bursting shells of peas, just chunks of murder left undone. War is mere death. Love made a man of me. What a line. Wow. And what a recognition of his own life. Love made a man of me. Yeah, it makes you grow up. Long distance. They called to me to tell me my father was dying. The wind was from the east as I glanced at the trees. Thanks very much, I said. And that kind of soft man, his arms raised, waved goodbye from the ship of his days. Old hymns and a lost communion turned me as I turned away. I stood again in that cold church, my father beside me, the clustered nuns before us, the wind at my satin back. My hand is still so much smaller than his. The surprise last line revelations. A thank you note. This is for Eve. I have never written a poem, not one when I met you, not counting the Latin translated for classes. I'd never known the faint brush at dusk of silk and satin, nor handled in the light what I could own was mine. I think of all the things I've done or seen or heard because of you. The man in Kilkenny who said, "My God, your wife's a rare beauty," as we danced at the fair. My shy brothers looking a new way at me. All this I've had, all this, just so that I can write this sonnet to say to you, my life's the second weekend of a love affair, each blooming day as far as the eye can see. And I'm going to give you one more that has a funny ending. If life were a week, you'd be Sunday, I feel like the ravenous shark who's just heard the lemmings splash. I want to write you a song to quiet the flapping butterfly. Our love is child's play. First times are like old times. I can count to two. You have turned on the sound, and I feel like a ramshackle goat. You are rain so fine, I didn't notice you starting. You gave me honey and slumber, and I shall learn you by heart. Toodle-dee, doodle-dee-doo.
My name is Lucille Langday, and I was one of Dan's students. And I first met him in 1977. I was first a student in the MA program in creative writing at San Francisco State from 1977 to 79. And Dan always liked to say, I love teaching. I love the beginning of a new semester. I love seeing a new class. And he said, I always learn as much from the students as they learn from me. So I dropped out at that time without finishing that degree. But Dan's and my paths crossed again in 1983 when we were both judges for an event called the Poets' Dinner. There was another judge, Harold Witt, and we had meetings in person to discuss the poems that had been entered in this contest. There was no internet or Zoom or email then, and Dan wouldn't have wanted to do it that way anyhow. So we came to the meetings, and he was just, there was nothing boring for him. It was not drudgery to read these hundreds of poems and talk about them. There were something like 6 categories of poems. We had to pick the first, second, and third winners in each of the categories, and we also had to pick the honorable mentions. And Dan had something interesting and fun to say about all of these poems. So that was my second encounter with Dan. Then in the 1990s, I decided I wanted to go back to San Francisco State and finish that MA. And so right at the beginning, I went to see Dan in his office, and he said, welcome back. I'm so glad you're here. It's been a few semesters. In fact, it had been 18 years. And so from that time on, that was 1997 until 2024, we were continuously in touch. We became friends and colleagues, and Dan and Eve came to my house for lunch, and my husband and I went to their house for lunch. Dan encouraged me to come back to San Francisco State to do my MFA, which I did. So for both of my degrees there, he was my advisor and my thesis reader. So I hope he did learn something from me, but I definitely learned a lot from him. So then, in addition to that, he always stayed in touch by mail, and he sent me wonderful letters, and the letters were always fun and full of interesting things. So I'm going to read you just a little bit from one of his letters, and then I'll read the poem he sent with this letter, because his letters always included a poem. So, he says, Lucy, I must have known you as Lucille when you were first a student, and yet I don't think so. I remember being glad when you were here that your middle name wasn't Sandra. The resulting LSD would have been unlucky back then. So I had sent him a slender anthology that I'd edited called Poetry and Science, Writing Our Way to Discovery. And so this is part of his response to that. In the early 50s, Eve and I lived on Manhattan. We met the only female engineering major at Columbia, which is huge. Her life made hell sound like a vacation spa. Then he said, I just happened to be working on a poem about gravity or gravitation. It came from a remark by Einstein. And this is Einstein's quote. We have reached the point in science where we have one term and only one term for each thing we don't understand. And so this is Dan's poem, Gravitas. If I were the poet I ought to be, I would write a lot about gravity. I think of it when I am dueling waves. It can shove mountains and it can stir graves. It can force planets to reverberate and give you your number. It is your weight. And think of it as a silent mentor, others as a constant tormentor. Gravity is a form of poetry. It works because it never misbehaves. And everything it notices, it saves. It cannot destroy, it cannot create. It won't do favors or retaliate. Don't look for a part where you can enter. It's pointing us all toward the center. And Dan was a very special person in my life.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa Hobbs, and it's such an honor to be asked to read some of his poems today and give a couple remembrances. I had the honor of being in one of Dan's classes at San Francisco State older in my life. And every class I went to, I was on the edge of my seat. Now, perhaps some of the students thought of it as an easy grade. But for me, every class just sparkled with new things to think about and new poems to write. What I am struck by is the timelessness of his poems, which I hope they will continue to live long after his passing from earth. For he covers subjects that have a timeless quality. This first one has to do with how fire affects us. And we've seen that in a cyclical manner. The crackling hills. The fire is near the sea as it grows, with animals diving in waves to swim to anywhere for a while. Anything to avoid the surrogate for the sun. The sea sends fog to cool the tattered grass, lend some modesty to the leafless trees. Then it sends the rain, a part of itself, to end one thing as it begins another. Even the splendid can be ruined. The warmth we need can be so angry it rages and destroys as it destroys itself, while beings glide below the sea's ceiling, where everything is guarded by water. We noticed all this a long time ago, which is why we made up good and evil, tokens for why we live and why we die. These other two poems are in this Poems of River of Earth and Sky. And Diane was one of the editors, or the chief editor for this book, of which many local poets are part of. And also, again, think of how much he was in touch with where we are today. My, it was the first good day in a long time. Even bald men took their kids for a walk. and I put on the mamas and the papas, stood at the window seeing marvels, dogs looking giggly, and the prick next door waved. And I found I was saying out loud, I must have done something good. I must have done something real good. This is a poem for the angel who has given the privilege of naming the color of grass, and who jumped up and down waving his hand, shouting, green, 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 oh, green, green. This one also, he had foresight when he wrote this one. The light by the door. I am astonished. No, that's not the one I'm reading. My student, I'm still a student of his, and I have to be humble. My student, when you hear, and you will, that I have died, you will be taken back to autumn days and how we would rehearse the different parts of teaching you of me. Even how I would let you see some tricks, that anapest is an anapest, of how it didn't matter how you tried to solve the riddle of the world, the maze that all of us explore, the way the heart's turnings come back to where the heart can see, where it can't stop. All we can do is fix as much as we can for the final test. One more lesson, I hope that you'll learn. The one demand is that you take your turn. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is John Pappas. I met Dan in 1972. And you cleared it up for me as creative writing. Whoever said that. It wasn't a poetry class, it was creative writing. I was studying theater arts, and I lasted in state for 6 months, I guess, a semester. And I was one of those guys you don't use machine guns on. I am from East Oakland, and it's just ironic. When I was 16 years old, I ran away to the hate from Oakland, and I stayed on Page and Lyon. And it's great to be back here, because it's been, you know, I reconnected with Dan about 4 or 5 years ago, and we did it, as all of you guys have mentioned, you've done, corresponded through writing, telephone calls, and for the last month, I've just been doing a lot of thinking about Dan. I didn't know he told me he wrote this play and sent it, but I didn't know he was even interested in playwriting, and I learned that from some of his poems, and it was great to know, because I did theater here in the city for a lot of years. Let me see what I got here. I found this one poem. I didn't, I've been listening. Don't do the one I'm going to read. No one did, thank God. And the one that you just read that had naming the lawn green, I couldn't handle it. I didn't know how to say green in such a creative, wonderful way as you did. Anyway, I found this poem online. I've got all of Dan's books, and this one I've never seen this poem. It's called A Morning Sonnet. Forgive my French. White sheets, but the rouge et vert of Matisse on the walls and at the window, the sun. A pet who's grown too big, quiet and stern. I am reminded of the first time in Rome, with the covers kicked off, the easy peace, and your friendly smile as you counted 1, 2, 3, 4, and then in French, while I learned that someday, somewhere, this would be a poem. We are old now. There are so many things gone or changed, steeped in a sense of doom. I fret about the young, the ones alone, looking for what matters, whatever brings a durable joy, a Roman bedroom, the shared thoughts we can have but not own. I wrote this letter to Dan, October 15th, 2021. Dear Dan, sorry this is coming separately from the manuscript, a heavyweight plea, but when I hung up the phone yesterday, I knew I wanted to send the book to you right then and there. I tried to type a brief letter to you, but I'm such an awful typist, I didn't have time to wipe my typos out or retype what I wanted to say. I probably wouldn't have made it to the post office today had I taken the time to make the corrections needed. I can't express enough how meaningful it is to me that you and I are communicating with one another at this time in our lives after having you teach me poetry writing at SF State University so many years ago. Again, just a reminder, you defended the fact that some of my poems rhymed when it was considered by many, particularly students in your class, that rhyming poetry was lame. I always remembered your support on that point, and I always appreciated you taking a stand. It's a full circle, it seems, that I am able to gratefully send you something that I've written at this point in my career and life. Seriously, it's a spiritual and magical experience to be conversing with you today by telephone and mail. So you know, your words are very powerful and meaningful, and they are relevant. They hold up well these days. With the turmoil and mass confusion, I only wish everyone could read them. I've quoted your poem, Law and Order, a few times with friends. And the idea of Christ having dreams in the tomb is masterful. Again, I cannot stress the importance and significance of talking with you yesterday on the phone, or how much it means to me. I'm honored that you even remember who I am. I used to love to call Dan because if he didn't pick up, I'd always get to hear Eve's voice. And that was really a thrill for me. And I hope it's still like that so I can call when I get back to LA. Anyway, this is from Dan. John, your kind poem inspired the enclosed. It also reminded me of a man who came up to me in a diner last year and shouted, "Do you believe in God?" I said, "The important thing is, does God believe in me?" A man in Manhattan also came up to me and said, "Do you believe in God? Take either side." That was it. All my life, every day was joy and a holiday, except for the holidays. I think I have one more thing here, yeah. This is a poem Dan wrote and sent to me on the 1st of January, 2022. I left everything where she had put it until the place looked like a museum. The unopened bottle of some lotion, rows of small shells from the nearby ocean. I knew they were all part of a beached dream and more or less a lifeless exhibit. I have noticed that nobody asks why, even when told not to touch anything, or linger too long at something she wore, or when suggesting this year's almanac, what could I say? What could I even try? I knew I was a puppet on a string. I lived what came later and what before. They were kept in place for when she comes back. I really had a lot of admiration for Dan. He inspired, and I'm not going to go on with that one. I'm just going to read this poem I was talking about, because after all, I'm from Oakland. I can't find it now. I thought I had it marked. There's so many relative poems in this book. How do you say this book? Querencia? Querencia. Cia? Like CIA? Okay. I thought it was Castilian or something. Yeah, right. I think it's got another meaning too, but I did have to look. I did go to the dictionary, and I did return. Dan used to say stuff like that. He goes, oh, you're writing a poem about Tiburon? You write about the city. Nobody, it wasn't a poem, it was a story. He goes, nobody knows what Tiburon is. They're going to have to look it up. And I kind of said, well, I got to look up a lot of shit. So this is Law and Order. This is Dan's poem, Law and Order. You know, I've been thinking right now in my house, I've got marijuana, nudist magazines, steel core pornography, an underage girl, a stolen library book, a complete set of Will Durant fraudulently obtained, a hypodermic needle, and 2 funny-looking spoons. Good thing I'm white. I have some hypodermic needles, too.
No, thank you. We have some of the readers now.
I'm leaving. Thank you.
Well, speaking of getting caught with your pants down, that's me, but I am wearing a shirt. This is a poem I heard Dan read a long time ago, and I guess it's the voice that to me is I've carried with me, and it's I think permission to overact in terms of delivery. And we've got here, what do we have? 5 exclamation points at the end. So this is my version of it. I guess my notion is sometimes the value of poetry is in the poems that you go back to with new life experience. So whatever's happened in the last 5 minutes, you can add to that, add to this. This is my. It was the first good day in a long time. Even bald men took their kids for a walk. And I put on the mamas and the papas, stood at the window seeing marvels, dogs looking giggly, and the prick next door waved. And I found I was saying out loud, I must have done something good. I must have done something real good. This is a poem for the angel who was given the privilege of naming the color of grass, and who jumped up and down, waving his hand and shouting, green, 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 oh, green, green. Okay. And I usually read last at gatherings. I don't know why that is, except that my last name begins with W, so maybe this is a good point to kind of, conclude this segment. So thanks.
Hello, I'm Kathy Gilbert. I also was a student at San Francisco State. I started after I retired from BART, so 2008. Maxine was a chair, Paul was one of my thesis advisors, but Dan was the one who I related to most closely on my thesis, and we became correspondents afterwards. And I just have one story and then one of his poems. It's around St. Patrick's Day, and we're talking in his office, and he says, well, you know what about George Bernard Shaw? And I said, what? And he said, well, somebody asked him, is it Celtic or Celtic? And he said, Celtic, certainly. And he sent me this poem, Points of View. I grew up near the Atlantic Ocean. I felt the gigantic sun heat the land as it revealed the color and the force that is to hold darkness hadn't been there. It made me see and it made me delight, rising as though it could have been asleep, waiting for its turn at the proper time. I went west and to another notion, just as comforting and nearly as grand, with the same gravity but different storms. Learned how it had to single with the air and the relentless arrival of night. Water is different when it is that deep, but we still keep its rhythm and its rhyme.
Hello, Mark. Don't get to see you much except on Facebook. My name is David Ferguson. I'm also a native San Franciscan. And Mark and I used to play in the Panhandle. We were both only children. And kind of like Howard Stern, it was becoming a very heavy black neighborhood, and we were a couple of white boys. I never met your dad except when I was a kid. But my father, was your dad a Gemini? Well, my dad was a Gemini, and while they came from different backgrounds, my dad didn't have the letters background. He came from Oklahoma, and he was a real cowboy. So he never was published, but he did have a few cowboy poems, and like Dan, they were about life. And I've been to so many memorials the last 5 years. It's kind of sad, but it's part of life. And if you'll allow me, Mark, I think two poems that my dad wrote. He differed with your father on one thing about poetry. He thought poetry should rhyme. He said he hated poetry that didn't rhyme. So my eyesight's not so good anymore, but this is called As I Traveled Through the Years. I've had a lot of laughs, and I've had a lot of tears, and I've had a lot of good times as I've traveled through the years. And when I think it over, I want to do it all again. For life has really been exciting and a friend. Oh, I've had a few times of sorrow, not more than I could bear. But when it came to happy things, I got more than my share. I've ridden a lot of good horses and worked a lot of cows. And to me, I've had a lot of good friends, more than the law allows. And I've watched the golden butterfly of love flit by on shiny wing. And when that touched my cheek softly, I've known the joy that love can bring. The spark of love is sometimes blown out by the storms of life. And I know how it is to be left alone with sorrow for a wife. Yet, life has been better to me than most, I believe, when I see what a tangled web most other people weave. I can look back and say that I did my best, and I've always tried to be the work and done, but it was done before I took a rest. And if anyone needed help, I tried to give a helping hand. Yes, I've had a lot of laughs, and I've had a lot of tears, and I've had a lot of good times as I've traveled through the years. So when my journey is ended, when my riding days are done, I say to all those who will listen, it's sure been a lot of fun. And for all you wild horse riders I rode with long ago, I wish I could see you all again for one more rodeo. Now, something that I didn't write, but I really wish I had, I think God must be a cowboy at heart, for he made the wide open spaces at the start. He made grass, the trees, and the mountains, and a horse to have a friend. And really, lead out old cowboys again. And then one more short one that I think everybody here can relate to. Okay, this is a real short one if you want. It's not near as long. It's not near as long. I think everybody can relate to it. My dad wrote this poem after he heard Martin Luther King make his I Have a Dream speech. And so he wrote this short poem that I used to read to my high school students. If you have a dream. A man has to have a reason to get up in the morning. Sometimes a dream will do. If you have no dream or reason, I feel truly sorry for you. For you will drift whichever way the wind may blow. In the summer, the sun will burn your fields, and in the winter, they'll be covered with snow. Your road will be rocky, and your hills will be steep. Your nights will be long and cold, and you'll toss and turn in your sleep. You will shout and cry out and wonder why good luck doesn't come your way. And if things will always be like this, and why good luck doesn't come to stay. Your cows won't have many calves, your horse will go lame. You'll accuse others of causing you troubles. You won't take the blame. You'll have so much trouble, you can't bear the load. But if you have a reason to get up in the morning, maybe a dream or two, things won't appear half as bad, and I won't have to feel sorry for you.
But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, for all the valleys hushed and white with snow. 'Tis I'll be here in sunshine or in shadow. Oh, Danny boy, oh, Danny boy, I love you so. And when ye come, and all the flowers are dying, if I am dead, as dead I well may be, you'll come and find the place where I am lying, and kneel and say an Ave there for me. And I shall hear though soft you tread above me, and all my grave will warmer, sweeter be. For you shall bend and tell me that you love me, and I shall sleep in peace until